The first time Olivia mentioned her neighbor, it seemed harmless enough. She'd just moved into a small apartment complex on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it had charm. The rent was low, which mattered more than anything else, and it was close to her new job. The complex wasn't large, just a few units sharing thin walls and squeaky floors. At first, she liked it. The other tenants were quiet, the street outside was lined with trees, and it was close enough to the grocery store to walk. But then she noticed him. "He's weird," Olivia told me during one of our late-night calls. "You know that feeling when someone looks at you too long, but they're not really looking at you? It's like that." "Do you mean, like, staring?" I asked, propping my phone on my nightstand. "No, not exactly," she said. "It's more like, you feel it. Like his presence is louder than it should be." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe he's just socially awkward. You're in one of those old complexes. The walls are paper thin, you probably just hear him a lot." "No," she said firmly. "It's not like that. He doesn't make noise. Not even when he's moving around. It's just this weird energy. Like he's always there, listening. Watching." I brushed it off. Everyone has weird neighbors, right? It's part of apartment living. But Olivia wasn't like this. She wasn't the type to get spooked over nothing. A week later, she called me again, and this time she sounded off. "He left something at my door," she said, her voice hushed like she didn't want someone to hear. "Who? The neighbor?" "Yeah," she said. "What did he leave?" "A flower," she said. "Just one? A daisy?" "Okay, that's a little random," I said, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't random," she replied quickly. "It was placed right in front of the door, perfectly centered. No note, nothing. Just the flower." "Well, maybe it's a gesture," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Some people leave weird gifts as a way of being friendly. A daisy's harmless, right?" "Yeah," she said after a pause, though her voice was far from convinced. The next morning, she texted me a picture of the flower. It was still sitting there, slightly wilted. She hadn't touched it. "It's creepy, right?" she texted. I stared at the photo for a minute, unsure what to say. Something about it did feel odd. The way it was placed so precisely, the lack of any explanation. "Maybe he's lonely," I finally replied. "If he keeps leaving stuff, just tell him to stop. Or talk to management." "Yeah, okay." Olivia didn't bring him up again for a while. I assumed she'd resolved it or decided to ignore him. But then, about 2 weeks later, she called me in the middle of the night. "I think he was watching me," she said, her voice trembling. "What? When?" "Earlier tonight," she replied. "I was watching TV, and I got up to grab something from the kitchen. When I came back, I saw him." "Saw him where?" "Outside my window." My stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Positive," she said. "He was standing under the streetlight, just staring up at my window. He didn't move. He didn't even try to hide." "What did you do?" "I closed the blinds and turned off the lights," she said. "I didn't know what else to do." "Did you call the cops?" "I thought about it," she said. "But what would I even say? That my neighbor was standing outside?" "Yeah, exactly that," I said. "It's not normal, Liv. You have to report it." "I don't want to make it worse," she said softly. That was Olivia's problem. She didn't want to stir things up. But it was already worse. 2 days later, she texted me, "He left something else." This time, it wasn't a flower. It was a pair of earrings. "What the hell?" I texted back. "I don't know," she replied. "They're not mine." That night, I called her again. What do you mean they're not yours? I asked. How do you know? They're old, she said. Like, vintage. I don't own anything like that. Maybe he found them and thought they were yours. I offered. She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said, they were wrapped in tissue paper. Someone meant to give them to me. I didn't know what to say. By this point, Olivia wasn't just creeped out, she was scared. She started double-checking her locks every night, keeping her curtains drawn, and avoiding her neighbor at all costs. But he was always there. She'd hear his door creak open whenever she walked past. Sometimes, when she took the stairs, she'd hear faint footsteps behind her, only for them to stop the moment she turned around. The worst part was that he never said anything. Not a word. He didn't try to talk to her. He didn't try to explain the gifts. He just lingered. The last time Olivia called me, it wasn't about a flower or a gift. It was about her apartment. He was inside, she said, her voice shaking. I don't know how he got in. What? I nearly shouted. Did you call the police? Yes, she said. They came, but nothing was missing. And the locks weren't broken. It's like he was never there. She paused, her breath hitching. But he left something on my pillow. What? A photo of me. Sleeping. Olivia sent me a picture of the photo he left on her pillow. It was grainy, taken in low light, but it was undeniably her. She was lying on her side, her face partially obscured by her hair, the faint glow of her nightlight in the corner of the frame. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach churning. How could he even take this? I asked her over the phone. I don't know, she whispered. I locked the door. I always lock the door. Did the police check for fingerprints or anything? They dusted the place, she said. But they didn't find anything. It's like he wore gloves or. She trailed off, but I knew what she was thinking. Or he'd been careful. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my house, every flicker of shadow, felt like it was coming alive. If this guy had been in her apartment without breaking a single lock, what was stopping him from doing it again? And what if next time, he didn't just leave a photo? The next morning, I called Olivia to check on her. I'm fine, she said, but her voice was shaky. I didn't sleep much. Did he leave anything else? No, she said. Not yet. You need to stay somewhere else, I told her. I can't afford that, she said. And honestly, I don't think it would help. He'd find me. I didn't have an argument for that. Over the next few days, things quieted down. Olivia didn't get any new gifts or photos, and her neighbor stopped lurking in the hallway. But it didn't feel like it was over. Then, one night, she called me again. Something's wrong, she said, her voice low and trembling. What happened? The lights, she said. They flickered. And then I heard. I think I heard footsteps. Inside your apartment? No, she said. Outside. Like in the hallway. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did you check the peephole? I'm too scared to look, she admitted. Okay, listen to me, I said. Stay on the phone with me. Just peek out the window. See if you can see anything. I heard her moving around, the faint sound of her curtains being drawn back. Then she gasped. He's outside, she whispered. What do you mean, outside? In the courtyard, she said. He's just standing there, looking up at my window. Call the police, I said immediately. I already did, she said. The police arrived within 10 minutes. Olivia stayed on the phone with me the entire time, whispering updates as she watched them confront the man. He's just standing there, she said. What's he saying? I don't know, she replied. They're too far away. Then she paused. Oh my God, she whispered. What? They're letting him go. The cops left a few minutes later. When Olivia called the station to ask why, they told her the man hadn't done anything illegal. He said he was just taking a walk, she told me, her voice shaking with anger. A walk. At midnight. In front of my apartment. What did they expect? I asked. That he'd admit he was stalking you? They don't care, she said bitterly. After that, Olivia started making changes. She bought a door jammer, installed a second lock, and started carrying pepper spray. But the fear never really left her. About a week later, she texted me again. He's back. This time, it wasn't just a flower or a photo. When she opened her door that morning, there was a cardboard box sitting on the welcome mat. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photos. All of them were of her. I drove to her apartment that day. I couldn't just sit on the sidelines anymore. When I got there, Olivia looked pale, her hands trembling as she handed me the box. The photos were taken through windows, around corners, from angles that made my skin crawl. Some of them were blurry, like he'd taken them in a hurry. Others were perfectly clear, showing her sitting on the couch, brushing her hair, cooking in the kitchen. There was even one of her asleep. This isn't normal, I said. You can't just stay here. I don't have a choice, she said, her voice breaking. Then I'll stay with you, I said. At least until we figure this out. That night, we stayed up late, combing through the photos, looking for anything that might give us a clue. But there was nothing. No reflections, no fingerprints, no identifiable landmarks. Just Olivia. And him. At around midnight, there was a knock at the door. We both froze, our eyes locking. Don't open it, I whispered. Olivia nodded, her face pale. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. I grabbed the pepper spray from the table and crept toward the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything. The hallway was empty. But then I looked down. On the floor, just outside the door, was another box. When we opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed Olivia and me, sitting on her couch, looking at the photos. And in the corner of the frame, reflected in the window behind us, was a man's face. The box outside the door wasn't filled with photos this time. It was a notebook. I felt uneasy the moment I picked it up. The cover was plain black, slightly scuffed, with no title or markings. When I opened it, my stomach twisted. The notebook was filled with handwriting, messy, frantic scrawls that looped and overlapped, like the writer had been in a frenzy. But it wasn't random. It was about Olivia. Page after page, he'd written her name, over and over again. Olivia. Olivia, my angel. Olivia, I'm watching you. The deeper I flipped, the more unhinged the writing became. Entire sentences covered the pages, rambling about her hair, her smile, the way she walked. There were detailed descriptions of things he couldn't possibly know, conversations she'd had on the phone, the songs she hummed when she thought no one was listening. Near the back, there was something worse. A sketch. It was crude but unmistakable, a drawing of Olivia lying in bed, her eyes closed, with a figure standing at the foot of her bed. I'm calling the police, I said, slamming the notebook shut. Olivia nodded, her face pale. The police arrived within the hour. 2 officers walked through her apartment, checking locks and windows, asking questions. Any signs of forced entry? One of them asked. No, Olivia said. But he's been inside before. I know he has. They took the notebook as evidence, but I could tell they weren't convinced. We'll keep an eye on the area, the second officer said, though his tone was perfunctory. If you notice anything else, give us a call. And just like that, they were gone. I stayed with Olivia that night, sleeping, or trying to, on her couch. The apartment was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan of the building feel like a threat. At around 3 a.m., I heard something. A faint tapping sound. I sat up, straining to listen. It wasn't coming from the door or the windows. It was coming from the walls. "Olivia," I whispered, creeping into her bedroom. She was already awake, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. "You hear it too," she said. I nodded, my stomach twisting. "It's coming from inside." We both stared at the wall, listening as the tapping grew louder. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The next morning, Olivia called the building manager and demanded he check the walls for animals or leaks or something. He was reluctant at first but eventually sent a maintenance worker to inspect the place. The guy knocked on the walls, ran his flashlight along the baseboards, and poked around the attic. After about an hour, he came back shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. "No rats, no loose pipes. Everything solid." Olivia and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What about the crawlspace?" she asked. The worker frowned. "There isn't one. These units are built right on the foundation." That didn't make sense. We'd heard the tapping. That night, I stayed over again. Olivia didn't want to be alone, and I didn't blame her. We set up a makeshift alarm system, empty bottles balanced on the doorknobs, a chair propped under the front door handle. It wasn't much, but it made us feel a little safer. At around midnight, Olivia fell asleep on the couch, and I stayed up, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. That's when I noticed something. A draft. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a faint, cold breeze brushing against my neck. I followed it to the corner of the room, where an old vent was set into the wall. It didn't look like it had been used in years, its slats rusted and clogged with dust. But when I leaned closer, I felt it again, the draft. And then I saw something move. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Olivia!" I hissed, shaking her awake. "What is it?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "There's something in the vent," I said. She sat up quickly, her face pale. "What do you mean, something?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it into the vent. The light caught on something shiny. A screw. Someone had removed the vent cover and put it back. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we called the police again. This time, they sent a detective. He was older, gruff, and didn't waste time sugarcoating anything. "You're sure it's not just your imagination?" he asked, inspecting the vent. "We're sure," I said firmly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll have forensics take a look. In the meantime, I'd suggest staying somewhere else for a while." Olivia packed a bag and came to stay at my place. For a few days, things were calm. Quiet. But then, on the third night, she woke me up, shaking my arm. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I grabbed the pepper spray and followed her to the window. A man was standing in the driveway. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring up at us. It wasn't the neighbor. It was someone else. When the man finally moved, he didn't leave. He walked to Olivia's car, leaned in close, and pressed his hand against the window. The next morning, we found what he'd left behind. It was a bloody handprint. We stood in the driveway, staring at the crimson smear on Olivia's car window. The handprint was too large to be a mistake. The fingers were long, pressed with intention. "He did this to scare me," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "He's not just trying to scare you," I said, my throat dry. "He's sending a message." The police arrived within 20 minutes, snapping photos and taking statements, but it was clear they didn't think much of it. "It could have been a prank," one officer said, shrugging. Kids trying to mess with you. It's not a prank, I snapped. This isn't random. It's the same guy who left the notebook. Do you have proof of that? The officer asked. No, but. Then there's not much we can do, he said, cutting me off. Olivia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What if he comes back? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer hesitated, then said, make sure your doors are locked. And if you see anything else, give us a call. That night, Olivia didn't feel safe at my place anymore. We decided to go back to her apartment, partly because we didn't know where else to go, and partly because we didn't want to let this guy chase us out. But the apartment didn't feel like hers anymore. The air felt heavier, like the walls themselves were watching us. I helped her recheck the locks, jamming a metal bar under the front door for extra security. You'll stay, right? She asked as we sat on the couch. Of course, I said. But I didn't tell her what I was really thinking. That if he wanted to get in, no lock would stop him. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Olivia moving around. But when I opened my eyes, she was still on the couch, curled up under a blanket. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from above us. I sat up slowly, listening as the sound grew louder. It wasn't frantic, like someone running. It was deliberate. Heavy. I shook Olivia awake. There's someone on the roof, I whispered. Her eyes widened. Are you sure? The footsteps stopped. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, from the direction of her bedroom, we heard a soft creak. The window, Olivia whispered. I grabbed the pepper spray and crept toward the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint outline of the window in the darkness. It was open. I flicked on the light, the sudden brightness making me blink. The room was empty. The curtains fluttered gently in the cold night air, but there was no sign of anyone. Is he gone? Olivia asked, peeking in behind me. I don't know, I said. I shut the window and locked it, double-checking to make sure it wouldn't budge. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There was a message, scratched into the glass. I can still see you. Olivia broke down. She sat on the floor, her head in her hands, tears streaming down her face. We can't stay here, she said between sobs. We can't. I helped her up, trying to stay calm. We'll go to a motel, I said. Just for tonight. Somewhere he can't find us. She nodded, grabbing her bag and shoving whatever she could into it. We left within 10 minutes. The motel was nothing fancy, but it felt safer than the apartment. The clerk didn't ask questions when we paid in cash, and our room was tucked in the far corner of the building. Olivia collapsed on the bed, exhausted, while I sat by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were out of his reach. But that didn't last long. At around 4 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Motel 6, room 203. You can't hide. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. How did he know where we were? Olivia, I whispered, shaking her awake. What? She mumbled, sitting up. I showed her the text. Her face went pale. I jumped to my feet, checking the locks on the door and the window. Everything was secure, but it didn't matter. He'd found us. The parking lot was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was close. Watching. And then, from somewhere outside, I heard it. The tapping. It started softly, like fingernails against glass. I looked toward the window, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the silence of the room. It's coming from the bathroom, Olivia whispered. I grabbed the pepper spray and approached the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was louder now, faster, like someone was clawing at the wall. "Stay back," I told Olivia as I reached for the doorknob. The tapping stopped. I swung the door open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bathroom was empty. But on the mirror, written in steam, were 3 words. "You are mine." Before I could move, the bathroom door slammed shut behind me. And I realized I wasn't alone. The bathroom door slammed shut so hard that the mirror rattled on its hooks. I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The air in the room felt wrong, too cold, too heavy, and the silence was suffocating. "Olivia?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. "Olivia!" I shouted, pounding on the door. I could hear her faint voice from the other side, muffled and frantic. "What's happening? Are you okay? The door won't open." I shouted back. The steam on the mirror began to shift, streaking downward like invisible fingers were dragging through it. Another message began to appear, written in long, jagged strokes. "You shouldn't have interfered." The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. My pulse raced as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't move an inch. Then, behind me, I heard the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to keep fighting with the door. But I couldn't help it. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the dim light, and saw him. He was standing in the corner, his face obscured by shadows, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He didn't move. I took a shaky step back, gripping the pepper spray in my hand. "What do you want?" Finally, he spoke. "You should have left her alone," he said, his voice low and raspy. "She's mine." "She's not yours," I snapped. "Leave her alone." His head tilted further, his silhouette almost unnatural. "You don't understand. You never did." Before I could respond, the light flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam was weak, sputtering. The air grew colder, and I felt him move, closer this time, his presence suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the door flew open behind me. "Get out!" Olivia screamed from the other side. I didn't hesitate. I stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. "What happened?" Olivia asked, her face pale. "He was in there," I said, my voice shaking. "What?" I grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't bother packing. We ran out of the motel and into the parking lot, the cold air biting at our skin. My car was parked under a flickering streetlight. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The words, "Stay away," were scratched into the hood. We got in the car, locking the doors as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my hands trembling on the wheel. "Where are we going?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "Somewhere public," I said. "He can't follow us if there are people around." We ended up at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, huddled in a corner booth under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. For a while, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, drinking bad coffee and glancing at the door every time it opened. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "What if he doesn't stop?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. When the sun started to rise, we decided to go back to the apartment one last time to grab her things. Olivia wanted to leave the town altogether, and I couldn't blame her. But when we got to her apartment, the door was ajar. "Stay here," I told Olivia, pulling out the pepper spray as I stepped inside. The place was trashed. Drawers were pulled out, furniture overturned, and shards of broken glass littered the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. On the wall above her bed, written in what looked like red paint, was a single word. Goodbye. I backed out of the apartment, grabbing Olivia's arm and pulling her toward the car. We're not staying here, I said. What did you see? She asked. I didn't answer. We drove straight to the police station, but by the time they sent officers to the apartment, the writing was gone. No paint. No mess. Just an empty apartment. Olivia moved out of town a few days later. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even me. She said she needed to disappear for a while, to make sure he couldn't find her. I tried to stay in touch, but eventually, her texts stopped coming. I haven't heard from her since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that motel room. About the man in the bathroom, the way he moved, the way he spoke. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear him. That slow, deliberate breathing. And I know he's still out there. Watching. Do you think Olivia was safe after moving away? Or do you think he found her again?